The Biology of Belief is a groundbreaking work into the field of new biology. Author Dr. Bruce Lipton is a former medical student professor and research scientist. His experiments and those of other leading-edge scientists have examined in great detail the mechanisms by which cells receive and process information. He has been a guest speaker on dozens of TV and radio shows, as well as a keynote presenter for national conferences. His breakthrough studies on the cell membrane precede the new science of epigenetics and have made him a leading voice of the new biology. Bruce, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Well, tell us about this book. It's very, very interesting. You know, I heard your interview with Art Bell a couple of years ago when your book first came out, and I actually listened to the interview about 4 or 5 different times because it's not very often on the Art Bell show that I hear a guest that speaks what I perceive to be absolute truth. And reading your book connected a lot of dots for me as a news reporter in terms of looking at the real world today.
Well, for me, it's very exciting because years ago when I started coming on this work and started lecturing about it, people would look at me and thought, man, you're crazy. and it's fun because today I talk about this stuff and people that are at the leading edge of science look at me and go, so what's new? And so it means we've come quite a ways in the last 20 years. And basically, my work, which involved cloning stem cells, and it's interesting because people think stem cells are something like relatively recent or new, and the reality is I was cloning stem cells back in 1967. So about 40 years ago, I had the opportunity to do experiments where I could take a single cell, put it in a petri dish, and let it grow and let it divide and divide and divide until I got thousands of cells. They were all genetically identical. And then what I would do is put them in 3 groups and put them in different petri dishes and change the medium, the culture medium, a little bit in each dish. And at the end of the experiment, one set of cells becomes muscle and another set becomes bone and a third set of cultures become fat cells. And it just floored me because it was like this simple, straightforward reality. It says, look, in all the cell cultures, they were all genetically identical cells. There was, as far as cells go, they were exactly the same. And they became different things. And so it was just the obvious question, so what controlled the fate of these cells? And the answer is, well, it wasn't the genes because they all had the same genes. What controlled the fate was the environment in which the cells lived. And it really, I was teaching medical students the dogma, genes control life, and there's my cells showing me in these experiments that they're being controlled by the environment, and it's like, oh my goodness, this is, you know, it was such a disconnect. At some point, I actually walked out of my tenured position because I started realizing that this science, people, my colleagues looked at it with, you know, it was like, well, they knew the experiments were true because they were there and they were involved many times, but they didn't want to accept the meaning of the experiments because accepting the meaning of the experiments pulled the rug out under conventional belief that genes control life. And so I left, and then I had an opportunity to end up at Stanford in the medical school there and continued these experiments and even did, you know, more deeply involved work on this question of how the environment was controlling the cells, published that work, and then again left academia because that was back in '92, and that was when the Human Genome Project was going full swing. And here's my work saying, you know, that I think there's something wrong with that model, and it's really wonderful because today, this is now a couple of years after the human genome results were reported. And what's important is this: the understanding that I was teaching about genes controlling life and the stuff that's in the textbook about genes controlling life require that an organism have somewhere 150,000 genes for a human to have 150,000 genes. The unfortunate part for that model is that when the human genome results are reported, there are about 23,000 genes, meaning there's 120-some thousand genes missing if you believe the conventional story, which actually is the conventional story, of course, is what's wrong. That we actually have to understand that we have the same number of genes as some of the lowest forms of animals on this planet. And so it really pulled the rug out again from the nature of genetic control because, you know, most of the genes are missing. So we're in this very strange, interesting transition in biology, it's sort of, I imagine it was precisely the same as in physics department back in like 1925 when everybody in there was teaching Newtonian physics, and then one day it's like, okay, now we teach quantum physics. And it's like, oh, wow, and so the issue is science is in a very, at the leading edge of science is in a very strange situation. It has to let go of its understanding of the way life works, that genes control life, and start to put more emphasis on the nature of cells being intelligent organisms that respond to the environment and adjust their biology to that environment. Why that's important is if, Alex, I look at you or you look at yourself in the mirror, you see a single individual person looking back. And then I'm going to say that's one of those misperceptions that we grow up with. Because the absolute truth is you're not a single entity. The fact is you're made out of up to 50 trillion cells. The cells are the living things. You are a community. You are made out of 50 trillion cells that are living together in harmony inside under your skin. In fact, it's interesting because well, you think that you have all these functions that we display as humans, respiration, digestion, excretion, nervous system, reproduction system, all these things. The fact is simply this. Most every cell in your body has every function that you display, even an immune cell. Every cell has its own immune system. And the relevance about all this is, in truth, inside your body is a civilization of about 50 trillion cells. And that these cells form a community. And the relevance about why I'm emphasizing community is that it's not that the cells form a bunch. I didn't say there was like a 50 trillion bunch of cells. It's a 50 trillion community of cells. And the relevance, and here's the critical catch. When you join a community, you join because of some common interest or some common goal or desire. There's a commonality to a community that holds them all with a shared vision. Well, that means when you join a community, you can't do whatever you want to do. You do what is really in line with the community so that as individuals, you really conform to the wishes of the community. Well, now I look at your body and I tell you, guess what? You got 50 trillion cells. Every cell is a miniature person in there. They live in communities just like the organs are like nations inside the body, that there are all these communities going inside. And the relevance about that is they're all connected. They have to be connected because it wouldn't be a community. And what holds them together, and here's the catch, what holds them together is what we call the mind. That our brain is the government behind the 50 trillion cells, and that the politics of that brain are really in the mind. Whatever the mind's beliefs are, that's the equivalent of a government. So the interesting thing is you can look at your cellular community inside your body, and in a state of health, you realize this: you got 50 trillion citizens living in harmony and blissed out in that world when the system is working beautifully. But when there's a state of dis-ease, the communities start to break up, and then the whole thing starts to fall apart. And the issues that we're beginning to realize in medicine now is that almost all of our diseases are really caused primarily by the mind and our lifestyles that are derived from that mind, rather than anything physically wrong with us. So, for example, over 90% of cardiovascular disease has nothing to do with something defective in the biology. It has to do with the fact that the mind that's running that community is so out of understanding of how to drive a vehicle, so to speak. Like if you want to look at their body as a vehicle and your mind is the driver. Without understanding how you drive the vehicle, you can destroy the system. And so we look at the ill health that's out here on this planet because of our belief system in conventional world. Your mind is not really connected to your biology. They always disconnect the mind in medicine, and they study the biology as a physical machine with nuts and bolts made out of biochemistry and genes, and that if there's anything wrong with you, it must be something wrong with the machine. And the reality is we've left the driver out of the equation. And why that's relevant is because we think we're just trapped in these bodies, and we don't realize we are not only the driver of these bodies, but the new understanding about how the environment controls the expression of cells and how the brain is the determinant of that environment. then get this fact. We dynamically control the expression of our own genetics. And as a result, we can create healthy genetics or we can create disease genetics. It's all a matter of what the mind is all about. And why this is important now, then stop and recognize, what have we learned? What does our world tell us in science about your biology? And the first thing it says, well, first of all, you're a victim. You're a victim because you got genes, and genes control who you are, and you didn't pick these genes, and you can't change these genes. So by the luck of the draw, whatever genes you got, that's your fate. And all of a sudden it says, well, then that makes you powerless because the genes had power and you don't. So that creates a problem psychologically and financially and functionally. Here's the problem. If you're a victim, you need a rescuer. And as soon as you need a rescuer, then you just bought in to something like and whatnot, which is really the pharmaceutical industry, because they're feeding you with that vision. So that's our belief system, conventional science right now. Yep, genetic control machine. Anything wrong with you is something wrong with the chemistry. Buy some drugs, fix the chemistry, and then you will be fixed. The new biology takes that model or image, throws it out, and says this. First of all, you are a vehicle, you are a body, you come with biochemistry, but 95% of the people on this planet got here with a set of genes that will make a healthy, happy, prosperous, loving existence for that person. 95% of us got here with a set of genes that should offer us a full, healthy life. And why that becomes relevant, and it says, well, if people in that 95% got here with a full set of genes that should have a good, healthy life, if they get sick, why? Then we have to say, because what we left out of the equation is that it's not just the body, there's a driver. And the driver is the mind. And if you're a driver like, let's say two cars come off the assembly line, and they're virtually identical cars, and one of them gets picked up by a kid who's, just got his license. He's 17 years old or something, just got his license, hot rod kid, and the other car is by a mature, responsible person, and they both drive the cars away from the factory. We can pretty much guess in a very short time the vehicle driven by the young hothead is going to have vehicle failure problems about it. Well, the vehicle with a mature person should likely drive wonderfully for quite a long time. And so the issue is, do we blame the vehicles for the breakdown? The answer is no. 95% of the vehicles came off that line in perfect condition. It's the driver. Then we have to say, well, the driver's the mind. And I say, yeah. And for all the years that medicine's been operating, we've thrown that mind out of the equation and said it's not really relevant to what's going on.
Bruce,
and that becomes a problem for us.
Here. Let's go ahead and just recap a couple quick points about the central dogma from how that started, going back to 1953, and the understanding of DNA, and where we are today with epigenetics.
Yeah, well, this is a beautiful part. Go back to the central dogma, the belief, genes control the traits of the biology, so that your life is essentially predetermined at the moment of conception by the genes that you got from your mother and your father. So again, that's the nature of a belief system that makes you a victim, since you have no ability to change those genes or do anything with them. You just have to live with them. Then we live the life of a victim. The new research reveals, A, there's not enough genes to make a human according to the conventional belief about genetic control, and B, many experiments reveal that you could take all the genes out of a cell, and that cell doesn't die. Cells can live for 2 or more months with absolutely no genes in them. And so the concept that genes are controlling the life of the cell, that doesn't apply. It says something else is. And so the reality is, somewhere along the line, the genome as source of who we are falls by the wayside, and the new science comes in and says that genes are blueprints. That's exactly what they are. You can, as I said, you can have defective blueprints, and less than 5% of the population actually are born with some defective blueprints. We call it birth defects, and we can understand why they have issues in their life. But as I said, 95% of us, we were born with a great set of genes, okay? But genes are blueprints. And what our old belief system is, a gene makes a protein. Well, that's still true. A gene is a blueprint to make the protein, and the proteins of the body are the things that give you your physical shape and your structure and your behavior. You're essentially a protein machine. So the genes are making proteins. Now here's the new biology. Old biology first. A gene makes a protein, and that and the character of that protein is expressed as your traits right there. But based on what genes you received, that's the type of protein that you get, and your traits based on it. New understanding. The gene is a blueprint, but the epigenetic control is a mechanism to read and select and modify the genes. So epigenetics, here's what's new. With epigenetics, one gene blueprint can make over 30,000 different versions of proteins. And all of a sudden it says, oh my goodness, the belief that genes are fixed is totally wrong. Every gene, you can make 30,000 different variations from every gene blueprint. You can create anything with this potential. And so the reality is the genes were not the controlling factor. It's the mechanisms called epigenetics, and then that's what determines the readout of the genes. And then you have to say, yeah, but what does epigenetics mean? And it means control above the genes. Epi means above, like epidermis is the layer above the dermis, the skin. Epi means above, so when you say epigenetic control, it means control above the genes. And it turns out that it's the mind and the belief systems and perceptions of life that we hold that shape our biology. So, for example, you would say old vision. Cancer runs in families, so there's a genetic propensity that the cancer is carried by these genes, so we look for cancer genes. New understanding from this, listen to this. There have now been enough cases that have been studied where children get adopted into a cancer family from an adoption agency or wherever. And it turns out when children are adopted into a cancer family, they end up getting the cancer with the same propensity as any of the natural genetic children in that family, even though this child comes from totally different genetic stock. The indication is that cancer is a programming.
Wow, that's a... when talking with you about these issues, it's like we're looking at the real nature of reality at a microcosmic level. I have a couple questions for you for the show's out in terms of what you call the brain on the cellular membrane.
Yes.
But before we get into that, take us back to those early years when you were doing those experiments with the cells, destroying the DNA and watching what happened after that, or was it the nucleus inside the cell, one or the other?
Yeah, well, here you have this whole belief system that you're teaching everybody, and that I've acquired, of course, through my own education, that genes control life. And then I'm doing experiments which are actually originally done in 1920. And that was remove a nucleus from a cell. And the nucleus is the structure in the cell that has all the genes. So by popping out the nucleus, it turns out that now you have a cell with no genes in it. Well, if you read all the books and everything you read, that the nucleus is called the control center of the cell because it has all the genes in it. So we talk about the nucleus as being the control. It also then becomes what we call the brain. So even textbooks say the nucleus is the brain of the cell. But then here's an interesting truth. If you take the brain out of any living organism and throw it away, that organism dies. That's just the nature of what the brain's function is, to keep it alive. So you say, okay, the nucleus is the brain of the cell, so we agree on that. Then you go in there and you take out the nucleus. It's a process called enucleation. You throw away the nucleus, and the cell still lives. And if you do this with some egg cells, from sea urchins or starfish, and you pull out that nucleus, well, the genes from one of these eggs, that the egg will actually begin to divide and form an embryo with maybe 60 or more cells in it, and none of them had genes in it. So all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, this whole thing that genes control life, there's something wrong with this picture right here. And it really started me on a quest to find out, well, obviously if cells can stay alive, some of them for 2 or more months, without a nucleus, the nucleus is not the brain of the cell. In fact, the joke is, why does the cell die without the nucleus in the first place? The answer is because the nucleus where all the genes are. And what are the genes? Blueprints to make parts. So when I need to reproduce the parts to keep the cell alive or reproduce the cell, that's when I need the genes. So the interesting joke is, here we've been calling the nucleus the brain of the cell, and in fact, the nucleus is the gonad of the cell. Its function is reproduction. And you know, the joke that I always talk about in lectures, of course, is that science is a male-dominated profession, and of course, since males have been accused of thinking with their gonads, it did make sense that the nucleus and the brain would be confused in that regard. But the reality is, the nucleus does not control the cell. And my research, after about 10 years of trying to understand it, it came to me one night after reviewing. By then, I started to track down that the brain of the cell was the skin of the cell, which is called the cell membrane. And why it's very interesting is the brain of the human is also derived from the skin. So the cell and the human, as I said, the cell is like a miniature person, structurally and functionally. So that the skin of the cell, the skin of the human, both of them represent where the brain comes from. And the interesting aspect about it was in understanding the mechanics of this membrane in biological terms. I was and particularly, it was like 10 years after I started getting into this. One night, 1985, I think it was about like 1:59 in the morning, and I was just, assembling a definition of the cell membrane in different terms than I had been using before and trying to describe its function. And I assembled this phrase, and the phrase is, the cell membrane is a liquid crystal semiconductor with gates and channels. Well, I wrote this down in biological terms, but when I read that in 1985, I said, wait, I have heard that same grouping of words to describe something somewhere. And there in the corner of my desk was my first Macintosh, and right next to it a book from Radio Shack. And the book was called Understanding Your Microprocessor, like a simpleton's book about how computers work. So back in 1985, I mean, it's like I need a little info. I was using it. So I turned in that book to the introduction, and then I read the definition of a computer chip, which is a crystal semiconductor with gates and channels. And all of a sudden I said, oh my God, the cell membrane and a chip share the very same definition. And at first it was like, oh, what a coincidence, what a coincidence. And in milliseconds, all of a sudden, all these neurons in my brain started to smash around in there. And all of a sudden I said, oh my God, it's not a coincidence. In fact, on a molecular structural level, they're essentially identical with each other. The cell is a carbon-based chip, and the computer that we use is a silicon-based chip. And really what it said is the cell membrane is a computer chip. It's an information processor. It reads the environment, what's going on, and then it goes to its hard drive, which is the nucleus, the genes of the programs, and the processor calls up programs out of the memory, which is the nucleus, and uses the programs to meet the challenges of the environment that cell is living in.
That's a great point. I just want to segue from that and kind of personalize this conversation a little bit in terms of humanity. You mentioned 50 trillion cells making up a human being. You also mentioned how humanity is made up of a colony of cells or human bodies, being humanity. Knowing that, how we're both receiving information, also beaming that information out, let's talk a little bit in the next 10 minutes that we have you left.
Oh, I'm sorry.
To talk about the human element and how we see this element in our world, bouncing ideas, energy, thoughts back and forth, constantly creating our world for better and for worse.
Well, what we're playing out here right now is an evolutionary leap, and this is what this whole 2012 is coming down to, and this evolution is such an exciting event, except because we're not informed of it and we don't see it, and all we see are the crises that loom before us. We don't see that these things that are happening are precipitating events of a major evolutionary leap. To give it, let's put it into consideration this way. Imagine you're inside a larva, and you and the other millions of cells in there are doing your job, and this larva is growing every day, and the machine's working. You are the cells. The cells inside the larva are just like a miniature population, just like the cells in your body. And that you're, looking around, everybody's working, the machine's going, the larva's growing, everybody's happy. It's, in good production. And then all of a sudden, things start not working very well. The systems start breaking down. And you start looking around, everybody's starting to get nervous. It's like, oh, the machinery's not working, and it starts to get dark. In fact, a lot of the cells start committing suicide in this situation. Inside the larva, the cells are beginning to die. And yet, from within those cells, a group of other cells start to come together. These are called the imaginal cells. And the imaginal cells start to assemble a new body, a new whole organism. And out from this decaying, dying larva grows this magnificent butterfly. It's an evolutionary leap. And why it's important is, well, if you put yourself in that larva before the pupa starts, and you start to see this thing break down, you would be looking around just like we are in this world right now and thinking, oh my God, the whole thing is going into chaos and it's falling apart, which it is. But the reality is, it doesn't end. It evolves into this next level. And the next level, there was already a beginning of it, and that is this, is that right after 9/11, there was a moment in time where almost all the nations of the world got together uniformly and said, enough is enough. It's time to end the violence on this world and become one. And, of course, George Bush decided that he didn't think it was time yet. So we lost that opportunity. And it's because we weren't ready, because if we were ready, we would have been there on the spot. But it's going to happen again because the chaos that's coming is going to lead to this. And the reason why is simply this. As James Lovelock, who gave us the Gaia hypothesis, emphasizes, the Earth is a living organism. We bought into the belief that humans are separate from this planet, either because of the church's belief that people got here as an add-on option at the end of 7 days of creation. They just threw some people on in here at the end. Or science says the only reason you're here is because the accidents of random genetic mutations. So there's no purpose. This whole thing has to end because the reality is there's a major purpose for us being here. We're part of this environment, and our absence or a disconnection from this environment is bringing us to an awareness that says, first of all, there is no such things as separate people or separate countries in a globe. The whole thing is one cell. The planet is one cell. We are part of this membrane around this Earth, and we are the brains part of it as well. And the relevance about it is that the countries which have walled themselves off from each other don't disappear in this evolution. They become the equivalent of organs. But they all recognize all these organs collectively, that there's one giant, one living thing. You can't destroy the air here because it's going to affect us somewhere else. Or if they do it over there, it's going to affect us. It's all of a sudden, it's like we are one. And this world has been based on division, and the evolution is saying that ends. It's a biological imperative. If you do not do this, we will go extinct. And the very bitter pill that's going along with this thing right now is this. There have been 5 mass extinctions on this planet where life essentially got wiped out and started all over again. And scientists have now revealed, from the understanding of the loss of species and the loss of environment, that we are now entering into the sixth mass extinction. And it's not just entering, actually. They tell us we're deep into the sixth mass extinction. Here's what's different about this extinction versus the previous 5. The previous 5 extinctions have been attributed to things like comets or asteroids hitting the Earth and causing environmental destruction. The 6th one that we're experiencing right now is due to human behavior in a large part. So the relevance about it is that we are generating our own extinction by destroying the environment because we weren't separate from the environment. We were made, in fact, in a biological reality as an image of the environment, that our bodies, our proteins in our bodies are responding to environmental information. So we are made in the image of this information. Well, why is it relevant is as we destroy the environment, we destroy the field that created us. And like the dinosaurs disappear, not because their genetics ended them. It's just they didn't fit the environment. That we are given a choice, and this is why it's real interesting. We're being faced with the evolve or die. That's basically, I guess, what it comes down to right now. And it's relevant for this is that your show, the people that listen to you, they listen to other shows, and all this connection. There's a large network of imaginal cells out here that are looking at this old dying larva, and rather than focusing on the larva, are realizing we must create this new entity, and the new entity will be one that will recognize its unity with the planet and with each other, and that this is one harmonious living system. And this divisiveness, which is almost all generally related to Darwinian theory, will pull out, because we live in a world where the primary theory of life, which is Darwinian theory, is that we got here by accident, yet that we only survive as a result of our ability to being the fittest in the struggle for existence, which basically says, oh, we've already fundamentally have a belief system that this world is a struggle and a fight for survival, and then you add that to the new biology we talked about just a little while ago, and says the mind shapes the biology. The beliefs of our civilization are ingrained and programmed in our mind, so that our beliefs about the world are then manifest in our physical expression of that world. And why that's important is, if we believe in a world that's violent, we have a world that's violent. And the new biology is beginning to recognize the power of the mind, and to recognize that the world is not built on competition. The new understanding of evolution occurred, but it's not based on competition. It's based on cooperation.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was just going to jump in a few minutes ago and ask you about that, the difference between Darwin's evolution and this type of evolution that's more dictated by the environment than by genes.
And it's interesting, this theory came out this actual theory of how this is working right now was by a guy that we call a buffoon in science. His name is Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. He came out with the theory of evolution 50 years before Darwin that implied that organisms and their environment are in a lockstep evolutionary process. And he said that the biggest challenges that face civilization is that they will separate themselves from nature. And that was in 1809. And that was 50 years before Darwinian theory. It was the first scientific theory of evolution, and turns out to be the most accurate one.
And you also, before we let you go, we're about out of time, you talked about internal and external environment. For example, I am, looking to move in the next month, find some new roommates, and I was going to one person's place to check out their spot, and it was right again back in the methamphetamine part of town, and you're already feeling through my membrane on my skin, the energy that exists in those neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
And it's always fascinating, because here in Portland, for those that are listening locally, there's a difference in consciousness with people downtown, people on the west side, people in the Hawthorne district, people on 181st and Powell Boulevard. I mean, there's a change, and so I want to create healthy thoughts inside me, and to the best of my ability, not obsess on the external world, but eat the best food and be in the best area and around the best people. I mean, where I'm knowing that our energies are going to bounce off one another and influence one another, because that's how it works.
That's exactly how it works, and it's interesting because you can read, we put wires on people's heads and read their brain activity called EEG, electroencephalograph. But there's a newer technology called magnetoencephalograph, MEG. And what's important about it is magnetoencephalographs read brain function, but they don't touch the head. They're probes that are outside of the head. And if you just stop long enough and say, well, wait a minute, you're reading the brain from outside of the head, and the answer is yes, because the signals of the brain are actually broadcast through the head, and that each of us is the equivalent of a tuning fork, and that the vibrations or the music we play is based on what our minds are into, so that there are different musics or different sounds, and people actually gravitate toward communities where that music brings harmony to their lives. And so, in other words, people don't live in accidental places. People get together based on the nature of the tuning fork that is in our heads. But then you put all the people together, and then you realize, what? Well, you're playing a frequency that's covering the surface of the globe right now.
Very interesting. Bruce, I want to thank you for coming on. That we learned a lot, and there's a lot of knowledge that can be found in this book. And also, Greg Braden, someone who speaks with you every now and then. I heard a rumor he may be here in Portland in December. I don't know the facts.
Go see him.
Go see him, I'll let the viewers know next week.
Listen, Alex, let me just ask. I have a website, brucelipton.com. Free articles of things we've been talking about. Download them free. References, download them. Resources, download them. It's all available free on the website.
Bruce, if you can, before I let you go, if you can in 1 minute or less, break down for me what someone can learn about the real nature of reality from reading this book or going to your site.
The most important thing that we can learn from this reality is that you're not a victim. That our minds are controlling our biology, that we've been programmed before we were conscious. Consciousness does not come into our lives until after 6 years of age. The first 5 years were downloads of data that consciousness would use when it evolves after 6. The principles and beliefs that run in our mind were put in there by other people and don't generally support where we want to go and what we want to do. And the problem is that those beliefs, which are in the subconscious mind, run our lives 95% of the day. So it says only about 5% of the day are you actually consciously controlling what you want in life, and 95% of the day you're replaying programs that you got before you were 6 years of age, and you don't see them play, and as a result of not seeing them play, we feel like we're victims. And when you understand this new science, you recognize how to deal with this invisible programming that generally sabotages us because the programs in it aren't from us. They were from other people that probably didn't share where we want to go.
Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, Alex.